back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today we have a sewing tutorial and pattern for this flounce to dress. So I have the pattern for this dress as the first link down below. Also, all the supplies and materials you need for this project are in that first link down below as well in the listing description of the pattern. And all the equipment I use throughout this video will be in this video description. As always, you know I love to reward my subscribers with a special discount code. So you can use the code FLOUNCEDRESS for 30% off until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. Now, the best part of this dress is that it is super customizable. You can do 4 flounce tiers to create a maxi dress, 3 for a midi, or 2 for a mini. You can do all flounces, you can do no flounces, you can do this dress maxi, midi. You can do sleeves or no sleeves. So that's why I'm really excited about this pattern. It is perfect for every occasion, from prom to wedding guest dresses to regular casual dresses, depending on how you make it. This is my favorite pattern I've literally ever put out. And if you want to see the process of me designing, patterning, prototyping this dress, I have a long form YouTube video that I will link on top of the screen. And I have a whole YouTube short series of me developing this dress as well. So I will link that on the top of the screen, and I'll link everything down below. I do want to let you guys know that the skill levels vary depending on what type of dress you're making. So the dress behind me right here, I would say this is more of a beginner to intermediate, leaning definitely towards intermediate, but I think a really strong beginner could do this. The dress I'm currently wearing is definitely advanced. So just keep that in mind when you're creating your dress, depending on what style you want to create. I think it's pretty obvious which ones are beginner versus advanced. Like, this is a very simple dress. This is a very complicated dress. So things like all those layers of flounces, that makes it more advanced. The fact that this one has boning and it's see-through right here, more advanced. The sleeves actually aren't super advanced. I would say the sleeves are more intermediate, so whatever sleeve option you want to do, that's more intermediate. But yeah, go ahead and watch this video if you're not feeling sure what type of dress you want to make. I'm gonna talk about the skill levels throughout this video, and I'm gonna show you how to do everything really in depth. So if you're a little bit worried, go ahead and watch this video and you can see what you want to do. Now, I'm gonna show you how to make both of these dresses in this video. I'm gonna show you how I made the simplified version first, and I'm really gonna go into depth with all the different sewing techniques you need to create it. So if you're making this dress, you still need to watch the tutorial for this dress because it goes very in depth. Like, I'm not gonna show you how to put the zipper in on this one. I'm just gonna say insert the invisible zipper because I already showed you really how to do it in this one, okay? So everything is in this dress, and then this dress shows you how to add on to that base. So make sure you watch the whole video. So without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. All right, so first we're gonna start by printing our pattern, and I want to point out the important note at the bottom of this sheet on the first page that tells you what pages to print if you're not printing any flounces. There will be more information about this in your instruction pamphlet. Moral of the story is to make sure you read your instruction pamphlet cover to cover before you get into anything, because if you don't, there's a ton of information you're gonna miss. So step 1 is to print out your pattern at 100% scale. I don't have borderless printing. That's okay if you don't have borderless printing, as long as you print it out at 100% scale. Now I'm gonna lay out my pieces of paper edge to edge without overlapping, and I'm just going to match up those lettered and numbered diamonds and then tape everything together. Then figure out what size you are based on the size chart. Make sure you're checking the size chart and not just guessing. For reference, I'm cutting out a US size 0. And once you figure out what size you are, cut on the corresponding line. And then I want to call out some important information on your pattern pieces. Make sure you're reading the labels on your pattern piece. It has important info on what to cut, how to cut it, the grain line. Make sure you're checking out all of your markings, so your darts, make sure you're marking those, check out your notches, and especially on your skirt piece, you will have some mark lines for where to sew the flounces later on. So I like to mark everything with a tracing wheel and tracing paper. So however you like to mark things, make sure you do that. And then another important call out for the flounces, they are not all cut the same. Flounce 3 is just a regular circle. However, flounce 1 and 2 have the marking to cut on the fold, but once you cut on the fold, you are going to cut open one of those edges. So you have a circle that has been cut open on one edge for flounce 1 and 2. So starting with sewing for style A, the simplified dress, we're going to start with the front bodice lining, and we're just going to pin and sew all of those darts. If you don't know how to sew darts, I like to start from the dart legs going up to the dart point. I backstitch at the beginning, but I actually don't backstitch at the end. I sew right off the dart, really close to the edge, and then I hand tie the thread in a double knot to keep it from unraveling. This just helps to reduce the bulk at that dart point. Now time to give those darts a good press. Make sure you are pressing all of your seams really nicely. I like to press my darts downwards and toward the side of the dress. Now it's the same deal for the back bodice. You're just going to pin, sew, and press all of those darts. Now for the front bodice shell, we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches in the seam allowance between each of your 2 notches. Only sew between the 2 notches. Do not sew on the side, the middle, or the other side. Now to sew the basting stitches, make sure you're sewing within the seam allowance. I do not backstitch at the beginning or the end of my stitch. I'm actually leaving long tails of thread, and I'm lengthening my stitch all the way as long as it can be. Now after I sew my first row, I'm gonna sew my second row about 1/8 of an inch away from that first row, making sure I'm still within the seam allowance. And then I'm just gonna bring that over to the table, and I'm going to separate the bobbin threads from the top threads. So here I have the 2 bobbin threads actually, and I'm going to just gently tug on those to start gathering the bust area of this bodice piece. I'm gonna do it on both sides, and basically my goal is to make this shell bodice piece match the size of the lining bodice piece. So I have the lining bodice piece underneath my shell just so I can make sure they're going to be the same size. Once the shell and the lining match, I'm just going to tie off all of those threads by double knotting everything. So I have to do it on the top, the bottom, and both sides of each of those rows of basting stitches. That way it just keeps everything in place. Now I'm going to place the front bodice lining to the back bodice lining, and I'm going to pin, sew, and serge and press at the side seams and shoulder seams. After I do that, I'm going to repeat the same process for the front bodice shell and the back bodice shell. So pin, sew, serge, and press the side seams and shoulder seams. Now moving on to the waist pattern pieces, I'm going to place the back waist pieces to the front waist piece, right sides together, pin, sew, serge, and press along those side seams. And then I'm just going to repeat that again because we have 2 sets of the waist pieces. Now I'm going to take one of those sets and place it right sides together with the bodice shell, and I'm just going to pin it right sides together. This can be a little bit tricky because it is a reverse curve, so my biggest tip for you would be to pin it really well. Then sew, serge, and press it, and I would recommend pressing the seam upwards. Moving over to the skirt, I'm going to place the back skirt right sides together with the front skirt and pin, sew, serge, and press along the side seams. I just want to say, be a little bit extra cautious when you're sewing these side seams because of the angle that they're cut out. They have a tendency to want to stretch. So when you're sewing it, make sure you're not stretching and pulling that fabric because that's how you can end up with some wavy seam lines. Now I'm going to take the bodice shell, not the lining, place it right sides together at the skirt waistline, and pin, sew, serge, and press. Now finish the center back edge of your dress somehow. I like to use a serger, do it on both sides, and now we're ready to put in the invisible zipper. I'm just going to install my invisible zipper in that center back seam, so I'm going to place it right side together, well unzip it first, place it right side together at that center back seam, and I like to place my zipper with the zipper teeth starting about 5/8 of an inch away from the top of the dress, and I'm just going to baste that in first. So I'm just using really long stitches, not worrying about if I'm close to the zipper teeth or not. I'm just trying to get it basted in there first to see where it's placed. And stop basting when you hit that zipper notch. Now I'm going to close my zipper and use this as an opportunity to mark where that waistline seam is and where the bodice and the waist pattern piece meet at that seam line. I'm going to mark that as well. You can use tailor's chalk, you can use pins, whatever you want. But this is the method I like to do just to make sure that all of those horizontal seam lines match up on either side of the zipper. Oh, and I also like to mark where I stopped sewing on the zipper. Now you can unzip your zipper and baste in that other side of the zipper to the other side of the dress. Once you've basted in both sides, zip it up, and you can check to make sure that those horizontal seam lines are indeed matching up. When you've confirmed that they are matching up, you can go ahead and use your either invisible zipper foot or regular zipper foot to sew really close to the zipper teeth and install that invisible zipper in permanently. Now just zip up your dress and you can check out your beautiful, perfectly aligned zipper. Now that the zipper's in, I would pause, try on your dress, see if there's anything you need to take in, any straps you need to shorten before going into the finishing steps. Now we're just going to finish off the center back seam by closing it up. So I like to flip my dress inside out, move that zipper out of the way, and then just line up my fabric, make sure it's all even, perfectly aligned. And then I'm going to continue where we stopped sewing from the zipper all the way down to the hem. Also, you can just clip off that excess zipper. Make sure your zipper is closed first. Also, my little trick for getting this seam to be seamless is using a zipper foot actually. It just helps me get really close to the zipper where that previous seam is. And I'm just going to press the seam open. Make sure you don't melt the zipper though, so be careful when you are pressing. Now going back to the bodice lining. So first I want to serge around these edges, so the center back edges and the waistline edge. And I'm going to take this bodice lining piece and place it right sides together with the dress. So I'm going to place it directly against the bodice shell. Make sure your dress is unzipped when you do this. And I'm just going to pin the lining to the shell all the way around the neckline and the center back. However, I'm just going to sew the center back for now. So at this straight edge right here at the center back, I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that that is sewn, we can sew the rest of the neckline. So we're just going to sew all the way around the entirety of that neckline. However, when you start and end your seam, you're going to do something a little bit special. So right now with the way my dress is oriented, the lining is on top. So I'm going to take that center back edge with the zipper and turn it towards me, towards the lining. This is a 1/2 inch turn, but when you turn, you want to make sure all that fabric is snug, is laying flat. You want to make sure that zipper is nice and snug inside there for this to turn out perfect. Now with that center back edge still turned, I'm going to sew and serge around the entirety of that neckline. Make sure you folded the center back edge on both sides. Now before I flip it right side out, I'm just going to make some clips in the seam allowance around those really tight curves. So around that front neckline where it's curving a lot, I'm going to make some little snips. Make sure you don't snip into your stitch line. You can snip into the serge, but not into the regular stitch line from your sewing machine. I'm also going to make those little clips around the back curves as well. This is gonna make your neckline lay nice and flat when you flip everything right side out. So now you can go ahead and flip everything right side out and check it out. But before we press the seam, we're gonna understitch. So to understitch, you have the body of the dress on the left, the lining on the right, and the seam allowance from the neckline underneath pointed towards the right. Now to understitch, I'm going to stitch through the lining and make sure I'm catching that seam allowance underneath, and I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from that neckline seam. So I'm going to understitch that entire neckline. However, you're not going to be able to get really close to that center back seam because the fabric just won't allow you to do that, but you're going to stitch for most of that neckline seam. This just helps your lining from rolling out and being exposed to the front of your garment. Now you can give the neckline a good press. Now to secure the waistline, I'm going to show you 2 different ways you can do it here, plus in the pink dress, I'm going to show you another way that you can secure it by hand stitching. So one option would just be to tack the lining down at those side seams at the waistline. This is a really easy method to choose, but it's just not quite as secure as this next method, which is more challenging. So for this method, I'm just pinning the lining at the waistline seam, and I'm just going to stitch in the ditch, meaning I'm going to put my needle directly in that waistline seam, catching the lining underneath. The key is making sure you're stitching directly into that seam, otherwise you're going to be able to see the stitch line. And this is what it looks like finished. You can't even tell there's a stitch there. Now I'm going to teach you how to do a sleeveless arm finish with bias tape, and I actually don't believe this is any easier than doing the sleeves. I feel like they're both pretty intermediate techniques, so feel free to do whichever one suits you. Just know that this one isn't much easier. Alright, so first grab your bias tape, and the way that this is going to be finished is it's going to be hidden on the inside of your dress all the way around that arm's eye. But before we sew it in, we need to secure that arm's eye since we are working with both a shell and a lining. They are both free from each other. So the first thing I want to do is bring it over to my sewing machine, and I'm just going to stitch those two layers together within the seam allowance. I'm just going to use a basting stitch, and I'm going to sew somewhere within the seam allowance to keep everything together. Now I'm going to take my bias tape over to the iron and unfold it all the way, and at the edge I'm going to fold it inwards towards me about 1/2 inch. Now I can bring everything over to my sewing machine. So I have my dress, the side seam right there. I'm gonna take my bias tape and place that edge right at the side seam. And now we can start sewing the bias tape on. So my bias tape is still unfolded. I'm gonna stitch right in that first crease of the bias tape. And once I've sewn all the way around the bias tape, I'm going to have about a 1/2 inch overlap between the start and the end. And then after that, you can just snip off the excess bias tape. So this is what it will look like. I'm just going to fold the bias tape together. You're basically going to encase that seam allowance within the bias tape, and then you're going to fold the bias tape again towards the inside, towards the lining, to be invisible. So I'm just going to do that step by step with my iron. So I'm going to encase that seam allowance like I said, and I'm going to give it a good press first. And after I've pressed this pretty well, then I'm going to fold that bias tape again towards the inside of the dress, towards the lining, and give it a good press again. Now to finish this off, I'm just going to stitch around the edge of the bias tape really close to the edge to secure it down to the inside of the dress. Now it's time to hem, so of course try on the dress, see where you want to hem it, and you're going to mark about 1 inch lower than where you want it to be hemmed. And a little bonus trick for you guys is I like to let my dress hang overnight, because when things are cut on the diagonal, like these side seams, they tend to stretch out overnight because of the weight. So this is optional, but I just feel like it makes your project look that much more professional. So if you don't have a dress form, fine, place it on a hanger and mark around the dress hem an equidistant amount from the ground. So I'm just using pins and going all the way around that dress hem. And again, if you did this on a hanger, make sure you try that dress on. Even if you do it on a dress form, make sure you try the dress on first before you start cutting. So once it's all marked, I'm just going to cut the dress there and then begin the process for my rolled hem. So little bonus tip for you guys. This isn't super necessary for this dress. I mean, it is a little bit, I think it's necessary for a lot of things, but this is going to be very necessary for the flounces on style B of this pattern. So now here are the instructions for a rolled hem. So I'm gonna bring the dress over to my ironing board, fold up the hem about 1 inch and press it. And then I'm gonna stitch from the edge, very, very close to the edge of that hem, about 1/8 of an inch away from that edge. But you know, the closer you can get it to that edge, the better. Now I'm just going to take my fabric shears and trim down that excess seam allowance really close to that stitch line that I just sewed. Again, 1/8 of an inch is a good rule of thumb, but I like to get it as close as I possibly can to that stitch line without cutting my fabric or cutting through that stitch line. Now I'm going to take this back to my ironing board and fold that tiny little hem up again and press it down. This is what creates that tiny rolled hem. Now I'm going to bring it back to my sewing machine and just stitch that down to secure it, stitch really close to that edge, and then you are done with your rolled hem and you're done with this dress. Well, style A of this dress at least. Now let's get into style B. And I do want to emphasize first that style B is the advanced version of this dress, while style A is the more intermediate. If you have not watched the full intro, go watch the full intro of this video now to get more information on that. And remember that you need to watch the entirety of style A first before watching style B, as I will not be going in depth again on all those things I already went in depth into for style A. So I'm going to start off with the bodice lining. I'm just going to sew all of those darts on the front and back bodice. And I'm also going to prepare my shell pieces by sewing the back darts and doing the bust gathers like how I showed you in style A. Now I'm going to take all of my shell pieces and place them right side up on top of a lining piece that is also right side up, and just stay stitch around the entirety of that pattern piece. Basically what we're doing is we're taking the transparent chiffon and matching it with a lining piece and turning those two pieces of fabric into one piece of fabric. So here you can just better see what I'm doing. I'm stay stitching around the entirety of that pattern piece. Like I said, basically to do that, I'm using a basting stitch and I'm sewing all the way around inside the seam allowance. So this is going to be invisible later on. Why are we doing this? It's because that shell layer is sheer. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to do this. You could just do what we did for style A. But this is the more advanced version. This is the see-through version. So this is how you kind of get around having see-through fabric while also having the inside looking really nice and professional. Otherwise, you'd be able to see all the seam allowance and the darts and everything through that sheer fabric. Now we basically have one set of shell pieces and one set of lining pieces. So I'm going to take the lining pieces, place them right sides together at the shoulder and side seams, and sew, serge, and press. And then I'm basically also going to repeat that for our new shell bodice pieces. So place them right sides together, sew, serge, and press at the shoulders and side seams. Now for the sleeve, I'm going to sew it at the inseam, and the inseam are those tiny little straight edges that you see there. Yes, you can just sew and serge the seam, but I want to show you guys how to do a French seam since this is see-through fabric. Alright, so to sew a French seam, you're going to place the fabric wrong sides together and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm just going to trim down my seam allowance to be about 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to flip my fabric so that I have right sides together. You can press this so it lays flat and then bring it back to your sewing machine and sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is how you create a French seam, which is perfect for transparent fabrics. French seams only really work though for straight seams. Don't try to do these for curved seams, otherwise they'll end up all puckery and they won't look good. But this looks fabulous. Now moving on to the waist pattern pieces, I'm going to lay everything out so I stay organized, and I'm just going to sew everything at those vertical seam lines. However, I'm going to sew everything wrong sides together. This doesn't matter for me because my fabric is the same on both sides, but if you have a right and a wrong side, you want to sew with wrong sides together. Then I'm going to trim down my seam allowance to be about 1/4 of an inch, between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, and then press all those seams open. But basically it just needs to be small enough so that when you put your casing for your boning on top of it, it is hidden. So you can use pre-covered boning that comes with casing. However, I want to make casing that matches my dress. So I've just made my own by cutting out a very long strip of 1 inch wide fabric that I've just folded both edges towards the center. Basically, you're just making bias tape, but not on the bias, just on the straight grain. Very easy. 1 inch strip of fabric that you've just folded the edges towards the middle. I also did this with my lining and my chiffon shell fabric just to give it a little bit more pizzazz. But again, it's whatever you want to do. Use regular casing, make your own casing, whatever you want. Basically though, we're just going to place our casing right over top of that seam allowance, and we're going to sew right on the edge of either side of the casing. That way it covers our seam allowance and it makes a new little boning channel. Now moving on to the skirt, make sure you've marked your skirt before sewing it together. If you forgot to mark it earlier, go ahead and mark it now. And if you want to know more about what I'm talking about, go back to the pattern cutting part of this video. But I'm just going to place the front and back skirt right sides together and pin, sew, and serge along those side seams. And of course, press. Now I'm going to do this next hemming step for both flounce tier 1 and 2. So I'm going to hem that center back area on both sides. So I'm going to press it up 1/4 inch twice and then stitch it down. Once we do that, we're ready to sew the waistline seam. So I'm going to take flounce tier 1 and place it against the skirt at the waistline, and I'm going to pin it in place. However, I'm going to start that flounce tier to be about 5/8 of an inch away from the center back of the skirt. So the center back of the flounce tier will be 5/8 of an inch away from the center back of the skirt on both sides. This is to prepare for the zipper later. Now I'm going to take the waist panel and place it right sides together against the skirt right over top, and we're going to pin, sew, and serge that waistline seam. Now, because this waistline panel is see-through, we want to make sure that that seam allowance at that waistline seam is invisible. So to do this, we are going to understitch. So we're going to move that skirt flounce out of the way. So we have the actual skirt on the left, and we have the seam allowance underneath pointed towards the left. Then on the right, we have the flounce and the waistline panel. So we're gonna stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line on the left side of the seam. We're gonna stitch through the skirt, making sure we catch that seam allowance underneath. And this is going to hold that seam allowance in place so it's hidden when you're wearing the dress. Now we have to sew on flounce tier 2. So before we do that, we need to finish the top edge. You can either use bias tape, or actually my personal favorite is to use a serger with matching thread. It's way easier, plus it also keeps the flounce from stretching too much at the top. Because it's cut in a circle, it will want to stretch, and that's not what we want. So I like to serge it with my differential feed at about a 1.5 to help keep this from stretching. Keeping that circle the same measurement from when you cut it is probably one of the hardest things about this dress. It wants to stretch a lot, so you want to keep it from stretching, but you don't want to accidentally gather the circle. So I would definitely just test this out, maybe on some scrap fabric, and then go back to your dress. Now I'm also going to place this flounce about 5/8 of an inch away from that center back seam to prepare for the zipper. And I'm going to place the top of this flounce right over top of that marked line that we created before. And I'm just going to top stitch that down. And again, it's really hard to keep this from overly stretching or overly gathering. So I would definitely pin this in place first if you're not confident. I was confident, but I would recommend you err on the side of caution for this. Now it's time to add boning into your boning channel. So I am just using plastic boning. It was pre-covered boning that I just took off the casing for. I'm going to trim it down to be the correct size. However, you want to take into account that you are going to sew another piece on the other side of this waistline piece. So you need to trim off some extra for the seam allowance. So it needs to be about 5/8 of an inch away from the edge because we have 1/2 inch seam allowance, so we don't want to sew through that boning. I also like to round off the edges of my boning before inserting it just to make sure there are no sharp edges that could snag my fabric. Then just place your boning inside your boning case. This is my favorite part of any garment. You just see everything come together, but you're gonna repeat this process for each boning channel. All right, so now we're gonna sew the bodice shell to the waistline. So I'm going to place the bodice shell at the waist piece, right sides together, and pin in place. Make sure you're trying to line up those darts and side seams with those boning pieces. That will just make your dress look even more professional. So you're gonna sew, serge, and press this seam, and it is imperative when you're pressing the seam that you press it upwards because we don't want it to be visible through that sheer waistline panel. Now let's get ready to insert the invisible zipper. So first, let's finish off those center back edges by just serging those edges, just like we did for style A. And then we're going to insert the invisible zipper and finish that center back seam, just like we did again for style A. Just be careful when you're inserting the invisible zipper here that you don't accidentally catch those skirt flounce pieces. Make sure you pull them out of the way. But anyways, once you've sewn your invisible zipper, this is what it will look like. Now that the zipper's in, I would pause, try on your dress, see if there's anything you need to take in, any straps you need to shorten before going into the finishing steps. Now moving on to the bodice lining. So we're actually going to finish this hem using bias tape. So I'm actually going to mark 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge, and I'm going to trim that off. Because we have a sheer panel in the middle, we have to do some extra special things to make sure nothing is being seen in that panel. So I'm going to go ahead, trim off a 1/2 inch from the bottom of this bodice lining, and then I'm going to just apply bias tape right on top of that. To apply binding, you're basically going to do the same thing that you did when applying binding to the arm side of style A, but you're not going to flip it that extra time to make it invisible. So here I have my bias tape unfolded. I'm going to place it at the edge, the bottom edge of the lining. I'm going to stitch in that first crease, and then after I stitch in that first crease, I'm going to fold the bias tape to encompass the seam allowance. And then we're just going to stitch in the ditch. So to stitch in the ditch, we're gonna sew directly in that seam we just created, making sure to catch the bias tape underneath. So this is going to secure the binding on the hem of your lining. Now that the binding is sewn on the lining, I'm gonna also go ahead and finish the center back edges of the lining as well. Then, much like style A, we are going to finish this neckline the exact same way. So go ahead and watch style A again if you need a refresher. So just to recap, we're gonna place it right sides together with the shell, the lining and the shell. We're gonna stitch with 1/4 inch seam allowance at the center back. We're going to fold the center back edge towards the lining and then sew and serge the seam. Then we're going to clip the curves, understitch, and press this seam. But again, watch style A for an in-depth tutorial of this. Now I'm just going to secure the bottom of the lining to the dress. So I'm going to line up the bias tape at the seam where the waist panels meet the bodice panels, and I'm just going to pin that in place so it stays really secure while I'm hand stitching. You can do really whatever hand stitch you want to do for this. I'm just going to do a very easy whip stitch to sew this down. So I'm going to take a little bit of the thread from the seam allowance of the dress, and I'm going to take a little bit of the thread from the edge of the bias tape and then pull it tight. And I'm just going to do this probably every 1/4 inch, and this is going to keep it secured in place. Now we're just gonna finish adding the tiers to the skirt. So tier 3 is a full circle. It's not cut at the center back seam. So we're gonna basically repeat that process that we did for the second tier, but for the third tier. So we're gonna serge the edge to prep it, making sure not to stretch it while serging or gather it too much. And then we're just gonna top stitch it on top of the line that we marked earlier for the skirt. For tier 4 though, we couldn't cut out our fabric in one continuous circle just because it was too big. So first, sew D at those side seams using French seams, or you could just sew and serge it, but I would recommend using French seams like how I showed you before. And then you can continue adding it to your dress like normal. Now it's time to insert the sleeves. So just like we did for style A, we're going to make the shell and the lining at the armscye into one attached piece by just stay stitching with a basting stitch around the entire armscye. And then I'm just gonna take my sleeve, place it right sides together with the armscye, and sew and serge that seam. The last step for this dress is to hem all of your hems. So the sleeves, all of the flounces, and the skirt, you are going to use rolled hems to hem everything, which if you want an in-depth tutorial can be found in style A. Now it's very imperative that you go back and watch that hem tutorial, especially the part about letting your garment sit overnight and then measuring the hem equidistant from the floor, because like I said, the diagonal of a fabric, the bias, likes to stretch, so your flounces after sitting out overnight may look uneven. So definitely go back, watch that tutorial. And one more thing, because there is a 2.5 inch overlap between one tier and the next tier, you have a built-in buffer if you want to kind of redistribute the length of each flounce. So say you need to hem the last flounce a lot, maybe you want to hem the other flounces a bit more to keep the flounce tiers even in distribution. I would say though, just make sure you keep about 3/4 inch to an inch of overlap between the hem of one flounce and the start of another flounce after hemming, just to make sure that you don't see the lining fabric. But yeah, after that, you are done. So that is how you make this flounce dress. This pink dress is probably my most favorite thing that I've ever made. Honestly, I love it. I feel like a little pretty princess. Let me know what version of this dress you are going to create. How are you going to customize it? How long are you going to make it? What fabric are you going to make it for? Where are you wearing this dress? Let me know. I hope this tutorial was helpful, and don't forget you can use that discount code Flounce dress until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time to get 30% off this pattern. And make sure you are subscribing and turning on that notification bell so you don't miss out on discounts in the future. So if you like this video or if you learned a thing or two, feel free to give me a thumbs up because it is the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. My handle is Kiana Bonollo. Don't forget that pattern is the first link down below. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.